It is the year 2472, and the Earth has suffered a great calamity. Hundreds of years of popular culture have vanished. Without the sacred films and texts for guidance, civilization is devoid of anything cool. Then, 3 incubation chambers are unearthed, and from within, men from the time of the great blockbusters emerge. Now, through highly interesting conversations, they share invaluable insight about what once was. The movies, the shows, the comics, toys, and books. This is
The Hyperspace.
Podcasting in the 25th century.
Welcome in, podcast pioneers, to the Hyperspace, podcasting in the 25th century, the interweb's first and only podcast. My name is Jared.
My name is Matt.
And my name is Mike.
And guys, I know we're supposed to be on hiatus right now, but for today's very special episode, we have come out of hiatus to bring to you what, Matt? Tell them what.
Today we are interviewing Christopher Munch, the director of the upcoming feature film, The 11th Green. The 11th Green, folks, is a UFO speculative thriller. It's going to have you thinking, it's going to have you anxious, it's going to grip you from the start. And we've got him today, folks.
Okay, so without further delay, we're going to bring in Christopher. Mike, I need you to tune the transmitter for transmissions.
Can anybody hear me? We found something.
Transmissions. The Hyperspace Interview.
Transmission commencing.
All right, guys, tonight on the podcast, we have award-winning filmmaker Christopher Munch with us. Now, Christopher has been making films since the early 1990s, and it's a great pleasure to have him on the show with us tonight. So welcome, Christopher.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, Christopher. I'm Matt.
Matt, pleasure to meet you.
And I'm Mike.
Sorry. And I am Jared. So, Christopher, if you could just, we're going to be talking about your new film, The 11th Green, but I wonder if you just kind of take us on a story of your journey thus far as a filmmaker. How'd you get into the business, your inspirations, and that kind of thing?
Sure. I mean, like a lot of people, I started making films as a kid. And then when I got out of high school, I didn't go to college, but I sort of mounted an abortive feature that I worked on for several years that was one of those things that turned out to be so bad that it never saw the light of day, thankfully. I did a couple of those, actually, that never saw the light of day. And then the first film that I had that was released came out in 1991, and it was called The Hours and Times. And it was a featurette, actually, technically, a medium-length work, an hour long. Like The 11th Green, it was a speculative history, dealt with a kind of lacuna of history, the man who was manager of the Beatles, Brian Epstein. After I did that, I did a period railroad movie set in the 1940s. And I did 3 other features after that. The most recent one before The 11th Green was called Letters from the Big Man. And that was at Sundance, starring Lily Rabe. And that was it tried to be a serious take on the Sasquatch phenomenon. Took place in southern Oregon in a very beautiful wilderness, the Kalmiopsis wilderness. And it tried to present Sasquatch in a more realistic light than some of the horror films that we've seen. And then The 11th Green, I started several years ago. I think the entry point for me into that subject matter was a short film that I had made in 2013 called Return to Electra Springs, which dealt with an inventor, a kind of outcast MIT inventor whose work in breakthrough energy had been suppressed. So I had some knowledge of this business of free energy and breakthrough energy and propulsion technology. And I think that was really my entry point into the whole UFO topic. I hadn't really known that much about UFOs or the Eisenhower presidency before I started work on the film. So it was a great journey of research and trying to sift through what's real and what's not real. And
Well, we were lucky enough here on the podcast to be able to get a viewing of The 11th Green. And we were all just talking about how thought-provoking the movie was. It was an interesting introspective view on what the 1930s and 40s UFO phenomenon with the secrecy involving it. And, after watching it, I sat back and I was thinking, what an interesting take. And the UFO thing to me almost became ancillary to the whole thing. But the concept that Christopher, in my opinion, that you so brilliantly put forward was the burden of knowledge that people can have in a position of leadership is, I think, very much underappreciated. Once somebody who's in charge of human life and human civilization has knowledge that it's their responsibility to keep it or disseminate it is tough. And I don't think that kind of idea is thought about too much in the general, like, hey, UFOs, release the information, let us know. It's a tough thing. And I think Christopher in the 11th Green really nailed it and humanized the presidents in this movie and brought them down to a very human level and really showed off how tough that decision is.
Well, thank you. Yes. And, I think what was so interesting to me as a filmmaker about the story, this speculative story, was the idea that, Eisenhower was a man of the people, certainly, and he was a very beloved figure. Obviously, the head of Allied expeditionary forces in Europe during the Second World War, the first head of NATO, president of Columbia University. He was ready to retire before he was recruited into being president. But I think, this man who didn't have an extraordinary ego himself, like many people who wind up in the office of the presidency, what intrigued me was the idea of how he would have reflected back on this experience if it had actually happened 10 years later when he was nearing the end of his life. How would it have affected him? And if, as I believe, he took a course on behalf of his people that maybe is not the course that he would have liked to have taken under optimal conditions, how would that weigh on him? The fact that this knowledge was increasingly secretized, the fact that that there was a concerted effort to keep the information from the public out of fear, that probably a justified fear in the early days that they would react, with hysteria or what have you, but also simply because they really didn't know that much in the 50s about the phenomenon. And how would this have weighed on him?
What was the inspiration for the storytelling method that you used with the interweaving with the past president, current president? What gave you the idea for that?
Well, the idea of having two presidents discussing this topic really provided for me a kind of setting in that only two presidents could really have. And one of the challenges of that, of course, would be that if they were really having such a discussion as this, there would be much more of a shorthand, I think, between the two of them. However, the audience needed to understand the film and needed to understand what was happening. So that component really evolved kind of organically. Originally, it was just to have been Eisenhower. Originally, there was to have been, originally there was just to have been Eisenhower. And a journalist seemed like a good framing device for the story, because journalists often make good framing devices where you have a lot of information that needs to be conveyed. So really the storytelling was a balancing act, trying to weigh the demands of conveying some of the historical information, some of which is speculative and some of which is not speculative, the demands of delivering that information, but also making an entertaining story that is not going to cause people to glaze over, So it was a delicate balancing act. And in a way, I have to thank my wonderful actors who really kept me on the straight and narrow, in effect, by pointing out where something didn't work. And as a director, I've always found that an actor's insights about what is playable or not playable is extremely valuable. And a director who is wedded too religiously to the words on the page as he's written them is doing himself a big disservice, because your actors are your greatest ally. And I find that, in the cutting room, when a scene really isn't working, once I figure this out after I've shot it and thought it was working, I realize it's usually always the fault of the writing, the reason that it's not working. So I tend to listen to actors very carefully. And the fact that my star, Campbell Scott, was a director also just was an added bonus, because he could really see some things and help me to clarify plot points that were not entirely clear in my text.
Yeah, Campbell Scott was fantastic in the movie. The actor who played Dwight Eisenhower was George Gerdes, is it?
Yes,
He's fantastic. I thought, what a cast job he was. I thought he stole the show for me.
Well, I agree. And that's not an easy role to play either, because he's such an iconic figure that for any actor doing it, you run a lot of risks. And there have been some very distinguished actors in the past who have attempted to play, who have played Eisenhower. with various degrees of success. Probably one of the most famous ones is Robert Duvall, who played him in a television miniseries about Eisenhower's relationship with Kate Summersby. But also people like Tom Selleck played him, E.G. Marshall played him. Who are some of the other people? Recently, he was played by, God, my mind is blank with names, but there have been quite a few really good actors attempting to portray him. And in my opinion, George does a better job than any of them, really.
He was fantastic. I got a question. So Christopher's father was a renowned astrophysicist. His name was it Guido Munch?
Yeah, Guido Munch.
Guido, and I believe my condolences. I believe he just passed not long ago.
Thank you.
I have to wonder. His father was involved. His research helped the missions of like Viking and Pioneer and Mariner succeed. And some of his research and some of his theorems are still being used by NASA today to help chart the course to Mars. And I mean, this is an amazing family he must have grown up in. And the conversations, I can only imagine, must have been in a different level to have that kind of access to that kind of historic time at NASA. Did he ever entertain the theory of UFOs or talk about that kind of stuff at the dinner table when you were a kid?
Not so much at the dinner table. I mean, in later years, certainly once I started work on this film, I asked him about that. And I think my father, he was a very orthodox scientist. He really didn't entertain, for lack of a better word, fringe theories very well. But he did know some of these figures. He knew Alan Hynek not very well, and I don't think he thought that highly of him as an astronomer. But of course, Hynek's biggest contribution was not in astronomy; it was in UFO research and advocacy. But I think, like a lot of people, my father felt that he took a fairly narrow view of the conditions that were necessary for biological life as we know it. And based on that, I think he felt it was a fairly remote possibility. But he did tell me that he had considered whether there was some sort of alternative or secret space program that had in fact, been pursuing things down a back alley. And after a lot of consideration, and apparently he had considered a lot, he had concluded that there wasn't. But interestingly, an interesting footnote to all this is that he was actually friends with one of the guys who is reputed to have been a member of the working group, the special studies group, the backroom boys, as they're called in the film, the Majestic, as it's been called by Whitley Strieber and people like that. Donald Menzel, Harvard astronomer, whom my father first met during the war when Menzel was in naval intelligence. And they remained friends, through the 60s. But my father knew absolutely nothing about Menzel's alleged secret work, and indeed, during all the time he was at Caltech, among Nobel laureates like Richard Feynman and his, people of that caliber, he never even knew that there was such a thing as the Jason Scholars, and that many of his colleagues had been a part of the Jason Scholars. So really his perspective was very much in the unclassified world, and I think he liked it that way.
I can imagine. The 11th Green goes on the premise that UFOs, we did have contact with UFOs, that the technology is in the United States possession, and it's being researched and studied, and to some point even leaked out into the corporate greed world, and it's starting to emerge. And there's hints that technology has already been adapted into society. So the premise in the 11th Green, by the time we meet Eisenhower, it's already been 20, 25 years already a part of the system. So by the time Eisenhower is president, he's already past the point where it's easy to manage. There's a lot of, as Christopher said in this movie, there's a lot of holes in the ship at that point. And by the time we see our current president, the ship is full of holes, and it's very difficult to kind of put the genie back in the bottle, or at least control it, I think. And it's an interesting, as Mike was saying, there's an interesting device to connect these two presidents. And it's very brilliant, and it's very intimate to watch these two men have this kind of honest conversation about, well, what would you do? How would you handle it? And to get that kind of access to these guys, and it really helped fold that movie together for me.
I actually remember when the scene that you kind of recreate when a late night talk show had asked President Obama about, hey, well, did you go and find out all the secrets? I mean, you must know them, right? And that, when I saw that a few years back, it's not something that I really thought of, but bringing that back in the film, it was a nice little callback moment to that actual thing that happened.
Well, it is interesting to see the way in which several presidents have responded on that show, which is Jimmy Kimmel's late night show. President Bush also responded in a very humorous way, but in a tight-lipped humorous way, as did Clinton. Clinton sort of lost it, actually. He really looked uncomfortable when he was required to talk about it. But, an interesting footnote there is just this past week, President Trump was asked the same question by his son on his Father's Day broadcast. And I would say that Trump's response, was perhaps, it went further than any of those other three guys.
He kind of hinted a little bit there. There's something behind the curtain, maybe.
He certainly did. Yeah. He certainly did.
And this movie is unbelievably timely in its release. I mean, just in the past 6 months, we've seen military naval videos declassified of possible unexplainable encounters. I mean, we're seeing a lot of this stuff now. And, as the internet grows and transparency grows, it's very difficult to have a lot of these things, stay hidden. As even in the 11th Green, we see that, there are entities trying to get information out into the public's eye. And it's an interesting thing of not the breakdown of secrecy, but the power of communication, information, of how the world is evolving around it. And it's difficult for the backroom boys to stay in the back room as much. There's a lot of pressure now to reach out and find out what's happening behind the scenes.
Possibly. I mean, I see it more as an inevitable evolution in human readiness to assimilate the information. And I think that, whatever organizations and individuals had their pulse on this for many years, and clearly, the intelligence community had their fingers on the pulse of it. It was the CIA who formed the Robertson panel, which formulated recommendations for, keeping this out of the public eye or just decreasing public interest in it. I think they are very finely attuned to the public readiness. And, one of the problems I have with the whole idea of waiting for disclosure, as many ufological devotees seem to be, is that it's just a continuation really of giving your power over to somebody else, and in a way it's a reflection of the way we've created our government to be a ruling government rather than a government that serves us, and I think as soon as we as citizens start seeing the government more as a government that serves us and reflecting our needs and our aspirations rather than powerful institutions, I think that then you'll see more, perhaps. But as far as there ever being any sort of honest truth and reconciliation about the history of this country with this subject, it's so deeply intertwined with issues of national security and secrecy that I kind of doubt that will ever happen. If for no other reason than there's been such great illegality associated with keeping secrets.
Yes.
One of the things that we saw that was very interesting, I think, is President Clinton's blue ribbon report on radiological testing, which involved declassification by executive order, I believe, of documents held by a number of different agencies. And it always fascinated me that he was able to get this through, that he was able to get it to happen and produce this. They produced a phone book sized report on all of these experiments that took place, on soldiers and otherwise. And it always struck me that on some level, perhaps that was a blueprint for what might have happened or what could happen with the UFO phenomenon if it were ever written about. And perhaps even it was some sort of consolation prize for Clinton for not being able to get to do the other thing. Because you have to ask, why would these agencies make this information available? And the only reason that any of them ever makes it available, I think, is if they get to keep something bigger a secret.
A compromise,
so yeah, it's interesting to speculate about, for sure.
Would you say that what you just said was the inspiration for the end when the decision was made not to release the information? Like, because, you really feel like when you're watching the movie, it's building to that moment when the
spoiler alert.
Yeah, sorry for if you haven't seen it. Oops. Anyway,
we will
would you
disclaim that.
would you say that what you just said, based on information getting out, was that like the inspiration for the ending that you gave the movie?
Well, I think any modern president, has to deal with the fact that the information that he's being given is limited about this subject. And one of the things that very interestingly supports that idea is the so-called Admiral Wilson notes that were released a year ago now. They had been in circulation longer than that, but they sort of were published about a year ago, and they purport to be notes made by the physicist Eric Davis in conversation with Admiral Tom Wilson, who was the former head of Defense Intelligence and who allegedly had been denied access to a particular special access program that he had inquired about. And the notes are very detailed as far as how he was received by the aerospace contractor who ran this program, both by the project manager and the security manager of the program. And this all rang very true. And the information that he was given seems to be, very incomplete. And it was only under extreme duress that they forked even that over. And, what part of it is true, who can say? So one could imagine an American president in that same boat. When we're speaking now of the very core secrets, the deep carved out sections, unacknowledged sections of special access programs. So in answer to your question, I'm my protagonist, the character portrayed by Barack Obama, I think represents, again, a balancing act between his desire to serve his people and an extraordinary knowledge of the realities, the harsh realities of the national security state, and what that entails. And only somebody in that position could really answer the question of, why would you choose to keep this information hidden longer? I mean, Jimmy Carter is probably the best example of a president who went into office with strong intentions to declassify everything. And he was very rudely awakened very quickly that wasn't possible.
Yes.
Yeah, I get the feeling that when after they get the inauguration, they walk in the new president and they go, yeah, all that stuff you said you were going to say, this is why you can't say any of it.
It's a tough position. There's a lot of entrenchment there by the time a president gets in. Do you think that James Forrestal was one of these white knights of the government that wanted the government to serve the people in all its entirety like that?
I think that he was. I'm not sure if I would characterize him as a white knight, but I think he was a very dedicated public servant. He was a man, who had made his fortune in Wall Street in the 20s and 30s, and then when war broke out, he, turned himself over completely to public service. And according to Eisenhower's notes for one of his books, by the time the war was over, Forrestal had said he had practically depleted his fortune serving the government. But I'm of the opinion that Forrestal was a proponent of gradual acclimatization, certainly not spilling the beans all at once, but I believe that he, like several people in the alleged working group, felt that it would be impossible to keep the secret forever. Mm-hmm. And I believe that Forrestal made overtures to people in Congress who could in some way bring forth the information. And in our film, well, I won't say too much about it, but in our film, he makes contact with one of those congressmen who might be in a position to read some of it into the congressional record. Because don't forget, on the floor of Congress, you have something called the speech or debate clause, so that what you say in that context is not subject to the same rules of classification.
That's a pretty big red pill to give to the people.
In doing a little research, Christopher, before you came on the show, is it coincidental that your last film was about Bigfoot and this film is about aliens and government dealings with aliens? Was it because to kind of put a broad brush to it, it's very X-Files, and is that interest in the paranormal and is that an interest that you have or have recently come to, or is that something that's been with you for a long time?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's a primary focus in my life in a generalized sense. However, I do have as I mentioned before, I had a very specific interest in breakthrough and suppressed energy technology. And I developed, the interest in Sasquatch developed in a very unexpected way, actually. And it came about really as a result of my interest in the geographic area where the story takes place. And there was a wonderful book written by a naturalist, not a UFO researcher, a fellow named David Rains Wallace, called The Klamath Knot, that took place in this region. And he speculated in a very poetic way that was born of his very deep travels in wilderness about the existence or the possible existence of a Sasquatch-like being. So I would say that my interest in these topics is not the result of a generalized interest in so-called paranormal phenomena. I mean, I couldn't care less about ghost hunting, or I really don't have very much interest in ufology per se either. I have an interest in exopolitics and the relationship of the nation state to the citizenry when it comes to the subject of visitation from other worlds. But I wouldn't say that I have a generalized interest in the paranormal, no.
Okay. So, like I said, that seemed like a coincidence to me. Go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, watching this movie, it's a pretty, I'm trying to think of the right word to say. It's darn it, I've lost the word. Ambitious. I mean, you're using like different time frames. This movie looks like it was a lot of work. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Yeah. Like it was, so how was the shoot on that? Like, was it a long shoot, or were you moving pretty quick, or did you have time to get the setups and shots you were wanting?
Well, yes. I mean, to clarify, the film I spent, as I do with, as I have done with almost all of my pictures, I spent, 2 or 3 years trying to set it up in the usual way, where you attract stars who are recognizable enough where they make financing possible. And it simply proved not to be possible, which is not in any way to disparage my cast, which I think is the strongest cast possible for the film. I love the cast of the movie, but it didn't make possible a level of funding, so I knew it was going to be on a shoestring. Having said that, though, my normal procedure for working is not to work in the kind of breakneck way that people typically work nowadays on a low budget film or a micro budget film, and instead, just using a very, very small company in order to buy the time that's needed. So that was the case with this film as well. Letters from the Big Man went even more in that direction because it took place in the outdoors and there were no sets, so there was not a large art staff. And whereas this film, because it was a period film that took place in interiors a lot, there did need to be a certain amount of art staff and makeup and hair and wardrobe staff. But still, it was a tiny production by any stretch of the imagination. So, for better or worse, what that results in is a movie that, of necessity, is handcrafted, because you have no choice. You can't throw money at problems to solve them. You have to take the time to solve them, to figure them out, to figure out how you can find or appropriate or utilize the resources that you need without necessarily having the cash in hand to pay for them. You have to think very resourcefully. And in that sense, I had a wonderful collaborator in my producer colleague, Valeria Lopez, who was very seasoned in smaller productions. I had a wonderful production designer, Jennifer Gentile, who had worked with me on another period movie, Color of a Brisk and Leaping Day, which was even a fraction of this budget. That was a 1940s railroad movie that we made, for $100,000 in the 90s.
Wow.
In several different states and all on film. So these people were really seasoned. My editor, Curtis Clayton, I won't say my editor, my editor mentor, Curtis Clayton, is a very seasoned, very capable person. So I was just grateful that these people, our composer, Mark Orton, just grateful that these people made themselves available for a film that normally would have been probably well beneath their the level of production that they.
Well, the 11th Green doesn't feel like a small production.
Yeah, it doesn't. You can really see the work that went into it. I mean,
the cinematography is beautiful. The art design is fantastic. The period pieces that you set up, you buy into it right away. I mean, it doesn't feel like a shoestring budget was put into this movie. So,
and it's easy to follow too. It's easy, like when you're transitioning to the different times. It's you know where you are. it's not like you're like,
well,
where am I right now? You're able to follow it.
I'll tell you, without giving anything away in the movie, there's a point in the movie just past halfway where I started to get quite anxious in this movie. So as things start to unravel and things start to happen, I'm saying I was getting more and more anxious for our protagonist. I was starting to get a little worried about him. But so there's a good energy and there's a good momentum to this movie. It's a beautiful movie. It's thought provoking. I have one last question for Christopher though. Do you think after spending all this time, I actually have two questions. One, when you were making this movie, were you looking under your hood and using a mirror under your car when you would go home from your dailies every day?
No, I wasn't. Although I do confess, at the earliest stages of writing the script, I was slightly paranoid. And in fact, it's rather funny. I bought a bunch of safety paper to send the script out on safety paper so it couldn't be copied. So it would say, "Do not copy." And I called the one company that makes this stuff, and apparently the only client they have is the Department of Defense. So,
oh wow,
this is me.
So they were instantly suspicious. Who is this?
No, they weren't. They were just unaccustomed to anybody ordering less than 1,000 cases of it. They said, "Well, how much do you need?" I said, "I'll just start with one ream of it and see how far that gets me." But no, I mean, it's all a question of your focus. And then, fortunately, I had colleagues who pointed out to me, well, look, why would you be uneasy? There's nothing that's really revelatory in the film. It simply, collates information that's already out there, and it's not as if it purports to, reveal secrets by any stretch of the imagination. And she said, well, just turn on the TV, which I don't watch TV, so I didn't realize that there are all sorts of things going on.
Well, it's interesting that the world is where it is right now, because my second question is, do you think that humanity right now could handle or is ready for this kind of revelation if it exists?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the interesting things about this movie is this kind of glacial time frame of it getting underway. I mean, I started the script in 2013. I didn't, get it ready to shoot, and it wasn't really ready to shoot till around 2016. And then we shot it in 2017. And in that time, it was done the following year, and I literally could not get arrested with the movie. I could not get anyone to show the film. Literally nobody. And it wasn't because people were saying, oh, it's so bad or anything. It's just that there really was this aspect of cognitive dissonance when it comes to this subject, particularly among, some of the smarter people out there who I think for whatever reason, they've bought into the indoctrination that, professing an interest in this is going to make you feel less smart or make you appear less smart. The journalist Leslie Kean, who was responsible for some of the reporting that the New York Times did between 2017 and 2019 on these incidents that you spoke about earlier involving the U.S. Navy, the Nimitz and the Tic Tac incident. She summed it up very beautifully when she said that the ban on taking UFOs seriously is so pervasive in our society that it is effectively metastasized cancer, is the way she described it. So these revelations, even though they have been out there for some time in certain circles, they are very important, because at a certain point, the smart population and also the population that may, not even the tastemakers or influencers, but just people in general, are going to realize, it's okay to formulate an opinion about this that is different than what we've been spoon-fed over the years, either through Hollywood, through, and I don't mean to disparage any of the, science fiction films or adventure movies that have dealt with this, but they, at the same time, it's not right to ascribe a realism to those stories either. So I think that the climate is much better now, and in that sense, I'm grateful that the film has taken this long to come out, because I think it is going to fall on more receptive ears, hopefully.
I don't think it could be better timed.
Sorry, real quick. I just want to ask, Christopher, what would you say is when you made this movie, did you have a goal in mind? Was there something specific you were trying to do, or are you just trying to do something entertaining? Because just talking to you, you're just loaded with information. So obviously, this comes through in the finished piece. So my curiosity is what was Was there a message? And if so, what was it?
Well, I definitely wasn't setting out to make a film to preach to the choir. You know, I really wanted a mainstream audience, perhaps, that didn't really have any preconceptions about UFOs or exopolitics. I really wanted something that would be accessible to a broader audience than just UFO enthusiasts. And so my objective in making the film was probably the same objective that I had in making Letters from the Big Man, and that is perceiving an absence of a certain type of filmmaking related to that subject and trying to step up to the plate, you know, and fill the void. I mean, I think there have been some very good nonfiction films on the subject, although many of them are made in such a marginal way that they're not that accessible, you know, by an audience. But as far as fiction feature films go, I haven't been, you know, really very much engaged by films in the last the last couple decades when it comes to this. So my objective was really to make a film that I, as a just hopefully discerning audience member, would enjoy watching, that would be satisfying on some level. You know, and what could be more satisfying than the idea that this everyman reporter is being offered some incredible stuff, you know. And then how does he deal with it? Just, you know, just as the question arises, how does Dwight David Eisenhower deal with the presumed reality of UFOs?
I don't think I'd want to be in that position after watching this movie and thinking about the kind of pressure these guys are under, especially if that's real information. I don't know if I want to be that guy going home at night and keeping that to myself on my pillow. I'd be a little worried.
Somebody says hi, and you go, "I don't know anything."
You can understand. Really worried. I don't know. That's a lot of pressure.
Understand Bill Clinton's discomfort on that talk show, or even Barack Obama's elevated heart rate, which is
that's why they go gray. That's why Obama, when he came out, was completely gray. That's tough. I'd rather deal with taxes and geez, the Middle East over something like that. I wouldn't want that under my collar, man. But the 11th Green, it opens this Friday on the 26th. It's being released through Joma Films in the theatrical at home platform, which is fantastic because this platform is helping independent theaters that were hit by the COVID-19 problem. So it's a good thing there. This movie's going to be helping a lot of those theaters that didn't quite get, you know, any traffic because of the pandemic. So this is all good stuff.
Well,
yeah, I mean, I'm really pleased that it's coming out this way, even though it is. I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt, but
no, please.
You know, even though it is fundamentally a theatrical film that, you know, plays better in a big theater, nevertheless, the fact that it's going to be more accessible to people who normally wouldn't see it in a big city is very pleasing to me. You know, it follows the trend of disintermediation, as they call it, where, you know, there's not a big gap between the makers of the film and the consumers of the film. So I'm really pleased about that.
Thank you, Christopher, for your time, and please, for any future projects, if you'd like to talk about them, please come on back on, and we'd love to have you on.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and it's a pleasure to share the appearance with your audience. I hope they enjoy the film. So,
everyone, go out and see the 11th Green. It's going to make you think. It's a good one.
Thank you.
Well, that was great having Christopher on the show tonight, guys. It was a real treat. Don't mind coming out of season 2 hiatus for that.
He's a super nice guy, and we really like talking to him. And independent filmmaker, you should really support.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for us, folks. We're going to go enjoy our season 2 hiatus, but you go watch the 11th Green. It's well worth it. It's a fun movie. It'll get you thinking. Have fun, folks.
You know you can't live without this content. So subscribe to The Hyperspace, podcasting in the 25th century. Follow us on social media, leave us a review, and join us next time as we take you into the 25th century.